Order, order. Robbie Moore to move the motion.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs Harris, and I really do welcome the opportunity to be able to speak on this very important issue, which has been raised to me by many constituents across Keighley, Ilkley and the wider area within the constituency that I represent. The issue that I'm bringing before the House today is specifically related to abandoned vehicles on public highways, something which actually is quite common, unfortunately, within Keighley itself. And as I see it, this is generally an issue of antisocial behaviour, which is linked very much to that, and I will get on to those issues as I develop my speech. And it has been brought, as I said, to my attention by many constituent surgeries, and by me visiting various streets within Keighley to see the abandoned vehicles for myself. Abandoned vehicles, dare I say, which are generally unroadworthy, untaxed, uninsured, without number plates, and have been left in a position on the public highway for not only just weeks, but months and sometimes years. And we are talking about vehicles that sometimes have engines missing, sometimes have parts missing, predominantly bumpers. Also, in my view, being used as a roadside shop for spare parts. And that is causing a huge amount of frustration to my constituents that are not only having to live on these streets and drive past these abandoned vehicles on a day-to-day basis, but also for the wider feel of what Keighley is like, because there are several streets, which I will come on to, that are within the centre of town that many residents have to drive past to get to work, to school, seeing these abandoned vehicles left. And I want to just try and use this opportunity in the House to get to the crux of how do we actually sort this issue out, where we have abandoned vehicles that have been left on the public highway for months, if not years, of getting them moved on. And it seems to me that we do have the legislation in place, but it is not being utilised to the full extent by my council, by Bradford Council, and I want to come on to this. Also, the point that has been made to me is the abandoned vehicles in certain situations are being left in places which are actually causing a nuisance to neighbouring properties, whether that is residential properties or indeed businesses. And Mrs Harris, I have a scenario on Brewery Street, just off Dalton Lane in Keighley, where one particular business that has been there for, I think, in its third generation, is being impacted by abandoned vehicles that have been left in situ for many a year, now causing issues with the business being able to carry out its day-to-day function, because delivery lorries are not able to get in because these vehicles are causing a nuisance. And quite rightly, this business is wanting to grow and expand, but can't get the delivery lorries in and out of its business because these abandoned vehicles have been left on the public highway. And of course, one thing that always gets thrown back to me is, well, these vehicles are on the public highway, but they're on not an adopted public highway. And I think we need to understand the difference here because, of course, as the legislation states, public highway relates to that which is a private road, but the public have the ability to drive down it, or it is a public adopted highway which the council, Bradford Council, has full control over. So, many residents, quite rightly, have contacted me because they are fed up with these abandoned vehicles and the slow progress which I have to say Labour-run Bradford Council are making in removing these vehicles. And actually, this isn't just a situation that is ring-fenced to Keighley. This is actually a wider Bradford district problem. The Yorkshire Post actually reported on this issue only in November of 2022, where there was a concerted effort within Bradford City itself by the council, and 90 abandoned vehicles had been identified on one street alone. And when the notice provisions, which I will get onto, had been served, various owners suddenly came out of the woodwork to claim their vehicle, despite these vehicles having been abandoned for years, flat tyres, parts of the vehicle not even there. Dare I say the engine probably wasn't even there in some of the vehicles. And that reduced the number of abandoned vehicles only down to 3, from 90 in which the council were then able to take action. So I think we absolutely need to try and get to grips on this issue. So certain hotspots that I have in Keighley are Ferncliff Drive. I met with the residents there over a year ago now because they are deeply concerned. This is a private road but yet a public highway where there are sometimes up to 15 abandoned vehicles, many of which have no number plates, parts of the vehicle missing, uninsured, unable to even get to an MOT centre, let alone having passed the MOT. So the council should be able to take action and move these vehicles on. And quite rightly, our residents on Ferncliff Drive are getting incredibly frustrated by this. And I met with them, and again, this issue was raised specifically on Ferncliff Drive at the Utley Safer Streets meeting, which I was kindly invited to. I've been there and spoke there twice now, and I get invited on a semi-regular basis to provide an update on the actions that I'm taking. And I confirmed to that Safer Streets meeting, which is full of concerned residents, that I would come along to Parliament and bring this issue to them. And I'm pleased that the Minister is in her place to be able to listen to this. Again, another hotspot is just off Dalton Lane, which is a residential/industrial part of town. But again, there are many streets off Dalton Lane which are used for simply abandoned vehicles to be left. And it is unfair on those businesses, as I've mentioned, but also the residents along the streets off Dalton Lane as well. And again, South Street is a very busy street, which you enter Keighley from the Worth Valley side of the constituency. And I have counted, every time I've gone up to Crossroads, Haworth and the wider Worth Valley area, 3 abandoned vehicles just within very close proximity to itself, and they've not even moved since I have been the MP, which is now, coming up to 4 years. So action has got to be sorted out, and this is despite me as the MP having raised this with Bradford Council and, of course, many residents and businesses. So I want to just get into the crux of, well, what powers does the local authority have available to it? Because it seems to me that Labour-run Bradford Council are not taking the action that they have available to them under the legislation. So the powers sit under Section 3 of the Refuge Disposal Act 1978, which gives councils and national parks, although that doesn't apply to my circumstance, the ability to remove and dispose of abandoned vehicles. And the 1978 Act also contains provisions which gives local authorities the powers to issue fixed penalty notices to offenders if these vehicles are not moved on. So I suppose the question is, well, what is an abandoned vehicle? Well, an abandoned vehicle can quite easily be identified, and yet the pushback that I'm getting from Labour-run Bradford Council is, oh, it's very difficult to decide whether or not a vehicle is classified as abandoned or not. Well, all they need to do, Mrs Harris, is go onto the government website, and it very clearly outlines what the provisions are for an abandoned vehicle. So it is a vehicle that has no keeper on the DVLA's database and is untaxed. Well, all you have to do is go onto the DVLA website and type in the number plate, and you'll soon find out whether that vehicle is on their database or untaxed. Point 2, it has been stationary for a significant period of time. And I suppose sometimes the ability is, well, what is significant? Well, if a vehicle has been abandoned for over a year, not moved, and that vehicle has got flat tyres and quite clearly has not got past its MOT, or is untaxed or uninsured, well, that, to me, relates to a significant period of time. And I think it is reasonable for the council to be taking action. Again, I put on record my frustration that Bradford Council are not taking this issue seriously. Point 3, if there is significant damage to the vehicle, it is run down, it is unroadworthy, or, for example, has flat tyres. Well, if the Minister kindly came to my constituency and saw, and I took her around all of these hotspots, she would see for herself that these vehicles are clearly classified as abandoned. It's burnt out. Well, Mrs Harris, it would be perfectly reasonable for a burnt-out vehicle to be moved on. Or, the final point is its number plate is missing. Well, so all you need to classify an abandoned vehicle is, it could be properly roadworthy, but if its number plate is missing, it's classified as abandoned. So I have multiple vehicles in my constituency that would be classified as abandoned, that are causing a nuisance to residents and businesses and need to be moved on. So what duty is installed onto a local authority, what powers do they have to be able to move these abandoned vehicles on? And the legislation is quite clear. It states that a local authority has the ability to move on an abandoned vehicle and remove abandoned vehicle from a public street if it is a private road but classified as a highway, or if it's an adopted road but classified as a highway, or it is on land in the open air, i.e. including private land. But I just want to focus predominantly on roads, because that is where I'm getting most of the correspondence from. So, if this abandoned vehicle is on private land, the local authority is duty-bound to serve a 15-day notice period. But that 15-day notice period does not apply if the abandoned vehicle is on a public highway. So why a Labour-run Bradford Council not getting on with it? They do not need to conform to the 15-day notice period, because it does not apply if a vehicle is abandoned on a road which is classified as a highway. That can be private or publicly adopted road. But quite rightly, the legislation does protect the local authority. And I think this is quite right, because the legislation protects the local authority because the local authority cannot be held liable for any damage resulting in their removal of that vehicle from the public highway. So this is protection measures that has been put to the local authority. And of course, the local authority has two options available to them. Again, incredibly frustrating that Labour-run Bradford Council are not using the opportunity that is available to them under the 1978 legislation. Option one, they could apply a penalty. Local authorities could penalise people who abandon vehicles or parts of vehicles. And yes, Mrs Harris, I've had parts of vehicles abandoned in Keighley. Again, much to the frustration of local businesses and residents. And that they have the ability to penalise those owners if that a vehicle has been abandoned on the public highway or on private land, and they can issue a fixed penalty notice or prosecute them. Now, I completely understand the challenge that is associated if you do not know who the owner is of that vehicle, or indeed the owner of that private land, but we're focusing on the roads here. So if you don't know who the owner is of that vehicle, then of course it is right that the local authority serves a 7-day notice on that vehicle. And if nobody claims that vehicle within 7 days, then the local authority is duty-bound under the 1978 legislation to take action. But Labour-run Bradford Council are not even serving the notice, let alone taking action if nobody then comes forward to claim that vehicle after the 7-day period. So I want to really outline that there are provisions within legislation that gives my local authority the ability to move these vehicles on, and they are not. So how do they dispose of an abandoned vehicle? Well, they could they have the ability to dispose of the abandoned vehicle immediately if either of the following points applies. Number one, it is only fit to be destroyed, i.e. it is classified as abandoned. Or two, it has no number plate or tax disc. So these are fairly easily identifiable measurables which my local authority seem unequipped, have the lack of ability to be able to find out whether or not the vehicle is properly classified as abandoned. And if I was going around, and if you gave me the job as a civil enforcement officer, Minister, I would quite happily go around my constituency and identify all of these abandoned vehicles and get them moved on, because my residents are sick to the back teeth of them being there, left year on year, that they are having to put up with these vehicles. So, if the vehicle is abandoned and we don't know who the owner is, the local authority has the ability to give that vehicle 7 days' notice, of which, if nobody then identifies that vehicle within 7 days, then the local authority has the ability to move it on and then recharge the owner, if that owner then ever comes back to claim that vehicle, the cost of removal and the cost of storage. Now, which I think is perfectly reasonable, but it does bring me on to the statutory instrument, the Removal, Storage and Disposal of Vehicles, Prescribed Sums and Charges Regulations 2008, which sets out how much a local authority can reclaim back from the vehicle owner should they ever come to light and identify their vehicle as theirs. And actually, I do think that there is the ability for the Minister to review the statutory instrument, because in my view, the removal costs, which the statutory instrument defines, is too low. For example, if a vehicle exceeding 3.5 tonnes but equal to or less than 7.5 tonnes, and the vehicle is not on its upside down, or it is not on its side, it is in a stable position, the maximum amount of money that the local authority can reclaim from the owner is only £200. And I just think that that is not, in today, as costings going to reimburse the local authority with the cost associated with removing that vehicle and disposing of it. And probably, let's give the local authority some due, that's probably one of the reasons why they are not taking so much action, because the removal costs that they are able to recuperate from the owner, should they ever come and identify themselves, as only £200 in that circumstance, and I don't think that that's enough. So I think that there's probably the ability for the government to review that statutory instrument. But the crux of this issue is, Mrs. Harris, is that my residents and businesses, and indeed anybody that comes to Keighley to visit, because it isn't one of the most awesome constituencies to come and have a look round, they are having to see effectively active fly tipping taking place, where vehicles are being left on the street, causing a nuisance to anybody that comes to Keighley to visit, who resides there or who wants to operate their business. So the second part that I want to come on to is how we challenge businesses that are actively using the highway to operate their business from, who are maybe using the highway to park for several years abandoned vehicles for spare parts. And that's actually where I think the legislation could be toughened up, because this comes under slightly different legislation, where, in my understanding. So I think that there needs to be more weight and more focus put on the ability for local authorities to take action against businesses that are using the public highway for parking effectively abandoned vehicles to enable their business to function. So they may be parking abandoned vehicles on the public highway to use that vehicle to get spare parts from to operate their garage business. And I think that is unfair that they are using the public highway to be able to do that. And my understanding is that we do have legislation in place on this issue which enables a local authority to take action if they are using legal action, if the business is using repair cars on the road, or if they are using the road to sell the cars on, okay? But I think that that has to be toughened up, because the only action that is able to be taken is one of a fixed penalty notice, which only amounts to £100. Well, that is nowhere near tough enough to create a deterrent for businesses being able to use the public highway to store abandoned vehicles on. Or it gives the ability for the local authority to take the business to court on behalf of the complainant. So therefore, that is relying on a resident making a complaint against the business for then the local authority to take that business to court. Well, you know, my residents have not got time or the willpower to deal with this. It should be the local authority being empowered enough to take action against that business to stop them from using the highway for carrying out effectively their business from, if they're using it as a storage camp for putting abandoned vehicles on. And of course, if it goes to court, a magistrate can only fine the business up to £2,500, which again, Mrs. Harris, is nowhere near strong enough deterrent. So to sum up, I am pleased that I have been granted time in this debate by Mr. Speaker to bring a very important issue to the House on the issue of abandoned vehicles on the public highway. It is an issue within Keighley and my wider constituency. I do think that the local authorities are empowered enough to be able to remove abandoned vehicles, but it is incredibly frustrating that Labour and Bradford Council are not using the powers that are afforded to them sufficiently. But I do think that when it comes to businesses using the public highway to effectively store abandoned vehicles, we could go further in using tougher legislative provisions. And I'd also urge the Minister to look at the statutory instrument that I referred to, so that we can bring out much more tougher fines that will actually act as a deterrent. Thank you, Mrs. Harris.
question.
And thank you, Mrs. Harris. It's the first time, I think, that I've served under your chairmanship, and it's a privilege to do so today. And to follow on from my fantastic colleague and member for Keighley and Ilkley, because he is clearly a champion for his constituents and is in tune with what his constituents need to thrive and for their livelihoods to be prosperous. And actually, in speaking to this debate today, I was able to research some of the statistics on this particular issue and was shocked to learn, actually, that Bradford had the highest number of abandoned car reports between 2020 and 2022 outside of London. And I think that is being played out today in the way that the honourable member is citing a number of areas, and to repeat the areas, I will give way.
Does the Minister not therefore agree that if Bradford Council is one of the highest offending areas in the country outside of London for having the most amount of abandoned vehicles, that just demonstrates that actually the legislative powers are there for a council to utilise? But does she share my frustration that Labour-run Bradford Council are not using the powers that are awarded to them to deal with this issue which is blighting my constituents?
Minister Harrison.
I think my honourable friend makes a very powerful and effective point, and whilst I am not the Minister responsible for waste in DEFRA, I will recommend that Minister Powell meets with my honourable friend, and we maybe do consider writing to Bradford Council on this point, because as part of our environmental improvement plan, which we proudly published on the 31st of January, there is a clear imperative there to leave the environment in a better state. And whilst that's fundamentally about halting nature's decline by 2030 and increasing its abundance thereafter, making sure that we've got clean water, clean air, good quality soils, and making sure that we tackle waste and resources are fundamental parts within that 262-page document. So we need all councils, including Bradford Council, to play their part, and we also need residents to do the same. Clearly, on the issue of deliveries not being able to get to that business, clogging up the road on Brewery Street, that business will not be able to prosper. And the honourable member mentions some particular hotspot areas for abandoned vehicles, namely Ferncliff Drive, Utterly Safer Streets meeting, and he also mentioned Dalton Lane and South Street. And I would urge Bradford Council to focus on those areas, as my honourable friend has identified, as a priority, because this is clearly where the focus needs to be. And he's right to say, actually, that since the Refuse Disposal Amenity Act 1978 was created, as I was coming out of nappies, this act has been in place for local authorities to use to make sure that they take action, because it is a criminal offence to unlawfully abandon any vehicle in the open air or on any other land forming part of a highway. It's punishable, as he has said, by a fine of up to £2,500 and or 3 months in prison. As an alternative to prosecution, councils have the power to issue a fixed penalty of £200 to the vehicle owner as well. So there are clear legislative vehicles in place, primary legislation that has been in place for some 45 years that councils can use. And I would say that the recent research by Scrap Car Comparison, using freedom of information requests to city councils across the country, found that shocking statistic that Bradford had the highest number of abandoned car reports between 20 and 22. But in Keighley, clearly there are specific issues as well. And I think it's fairly clear to say that too many abandoned vehicles left to rust without due consideration from their owners for their correct disposal is clearly a problem for the environment. And it's also a problem for local residents, as he has set out. It is not acceptable to run a business on the side of the road for spares and repairs. And while some of these vehicles are just an eyesore, their nuisance goes beyond blocking roads, parking spaces and property access, because they pose a really serious risk to the environment due to hazardous fluids and chemicals that they contain, which can contaminate surrounding land, water and air, directly in contravention of what we all want to achieve in our environmental improvement plan and as society demands of us. So I would like to take this opportunity to outline some of the measures that are already in place. Of course, we're committed to encouraging local solutions for local problems, which is why I really do commend the Utterly Safer Streets group, and I'm pleased that the Honourable Member is meeting with those can-do people passionate about improving their community, who I will always commend and encourage. But before removing a vehicle, authorities must first decide if a vehicle is abandoned. And I'd like to confirm that, as my honourable friend laid out earlier in his speech, the points he made about a vehicle not having a keeper, not having tax, not having moved for a period of time, and I agree with him that 12 months is a significant period of time, and not being roadworthy, and where this is visually obvious with flat tyres or essential parts missing, panels missing from the vehicle, it is blindingly obvious that that vehicle is not roadworthy if that has been for a period of time, which is significant, and without a number plate. So I would also like to confirm that the legislation and the measures that my honourable friend referenced are indeed correct. Local authorities can dispose of an abandoned vehicle themselves. They can do so immediately if it's fit to be destroyed or has no number plate or is untaxed, as my honourable friend referred to. Otherwise, they can do so if the owner cannot be found or fails to comply with a notice to collect the vehicle. And to help councils tackle this situation, we've given them powers to penalise people who abandon vehicles or parts of vehicles on public highways. They can be issued with a penalty notice of £200, or for more serious issues, they can prosecute, which can lead to a maximum fine of £2,500 or a period of time in prison, 3 months. But I will take up the ask of my honourable friend in reviewing whether the statutory instrument could be improved to further enforce that. Because without the appropriate powers and the appropriate action, we will not achieve our environmental improvement plan legal targets, of which there are 38, and moral ambitions. And so I will certainly undertake to identify further measures that this government could take in relation to that. I would also like to touch on producer responsibility, because of course we're still producing new cars today, and we need to think about the future of how products that we make will be disposed of responsibly, and that is part of the work that we're doing across my department in DEFRA. So in addition to supporting local action to tackle the abandonment of vehicles, we are tackling the environmental impact of end-of-life vehicles. The End-of-Life Vehicles Producer Responsibility Scheme is a mouthful, but it has led to an improvement in the treatment of scrap vehicles and increased recycling and recovery rates. In 2018, of the 1.6 million tonnes of scrapped end-of-life vehicles, 93% were recycled and recovered, which it's an impressive increase from 87% in 2011. Under the Producer Responsibility Scheme, vehicle manufacturers and importers have a responsibility to establish collection systems into which end-of-life vehicles can be delivered free of charge. Local authorities are also able to deliver end-of-life vehicles into these collection schemes. Scrap metal has a significant value too, and because 75% of most vehicles are metal, they have a value even at end of life. People are incentivised to sell vehicles for scrap rather than abandon them on the road, but it is not acceptable for that vehicle to slowly degrade and for spares and repairs to be sold over a period of months and years, clogging up roads and also causing a blight to communities and a danger to our environment. On a similar issue, I would like to take this opportunity, Mrs Harris, to talk about local authorities having powers to tackle nuisance parking, where a business leaves 2 or more cars for sale on the road within 500 metres of each other, or repair cars on the road. They can either issue a £100 fixed penalty notice or take the business to court on behalf of the complainant, which can lead to the business being handed a fine of up to £2,500. Furthermore, if a member of the public has concerns that a business is selling a vehicle on the road, they can ask local authorities to make a control order. And if a control order is issued, the offender must stop selling vehicles on the road and can be fined £1,000. In conclusion, Mrs Harris, and to respond to my honourable friend's excellent points, and clearly the evidence is there that this is a significant issue in the Bradford Council area. I've demonstrated how government is supporting councils to tackle this local issue and how producer responsibility scheme is supporting individuals to properly dispose of their end-of-life vehicles. I'm aware that external research has showed that the number of abandoned car reports in Bradford peaked in 2021, and I do hope that the good people of Bradford, and in particular in his constituency, continue to enjoy dwindling reports of abandoned vehicles, because the legislation is in place. We will look at it to see if it can be strengthened, and clearly there is an environmental imperative to take action and not leave vehicles on the side of roads for months and years at a time. And I'd like to thank my honourable friend for bringing this to the House's attention.